Hey, I'm Rob, welcome back to PhotoBite. Last year, Panasonic announced and released the GH5 II and surprisingly, announced the GH6 at the same time, raising a lot of questions about what the GH5 II was supposed to be. In the end, it ended up merely being a small update to the GH5, bringing it slightly more in line with other modern cameras. Still had the same sensor after all. But in the end, I think most people opted to wait and see what this camera, the GH6, would bring to the table. Now looking at the design and build of the GH6, it definitely seems to have taken quite a few aspects from the S1H. The body shape especially, that blocky style with the much larger, more comfortable grip. And the LCD touchscreen flips out and about and all around, just like you've seen in the S1H, a must-have in one of Panasonic's video cameras nowadays, and it's great to see it come to the GH line. As you can see, the LCD screen does protrude quite a bit away from the camera body on the GH6. That's because they put a whacking large fan inside this thing. It seems to mainly be there to allow for the impressive set of resolutions, bit rates and frame rates that could all be recorded indefinitely without any overheating. You might be a bit worried about how big this gap is on the sides, but they say it's also still weather resistant even with the big ventilation holes on the sides. There's now a handy front record button, also nicked from the S1H, and tons of buttons and switches all over this thing. Almost all can be completely remapped and changed to whatever you want as well. There's now even a handy lock switch next to the viewfinder, which can also be customized to lock whatever you want and whatever you don't want while you're recording, so you don't accidentally fat finger this thing. Especially that front record button can be quite easy to hit by accident. They've added this handy audio microphone button, which brings up all the relevant audio information, great for monitoring and tweaking your microphones while you're shooting. And a final spin around the device, you'll see now that there is a handy record light on the front and back. And if you look on the bottom, the battery door has now shifted over to the side, allowing for no interference with the tripod plate. Also, the tripod plate now has a handy alignment pin at the top for when using those video style plates, which is great because it's always horrible when your camera suddenly becomes slightly loose when using a tripod. And again, back to the battery itself is the same one found in the S5, which is similar to the old GH5 battery, but slightly beefier and just with some extra pins on the top. Apparently you can use the old GH5 batteries in this camera, however you will be locked out of some of those higher resolution bitrate modes, probably due to power constraints. The way they described it is if you put a GH5 battery in the GH6, it becomes a GH5, and if you put a GH6 battery in, it is a GH6. Now all those features packed into one package definitely means that the GH line keeps its title of being a very chunky camera. And for a micro four thirds camera, 823 grams is quite a lot of weight. Now enough about the outside of the camera, let's see what's on the inside. Now for what everyone's been waiting for, the brand new sensor. Panasonic has created this brand new 25.2 megapixel micro four thirds sensor for the GH6, which gives you a high-res, high-speed signal readout, reducing the rolling shutter and achieving a much wider dynamic range. Now, to run this sensor, the new Venus engine has also been upgraded. This new engine promises to deliver around double the performance of its older siblings, allowing for high-speed processing of the new sensor's higher pixel count and higher resolution, higher bitrate video. Now, the new engine and the new sensor allows this camera to get an impressive 13 stops of dynamic range with the dynamic range boost mode on. More on that later. Now in the media and I/O department, the GH6 now sports a CF Express Type B port. But whether or not you're happy about it, it also still has an SD card slot if you do want to use SD. The SD card slot can support any of the shooting modes up to 600 megabits per second. Obviously you'd need a very fast V90 SD card for those higher modes. Anything higher, however, you will need to use the CF Express. The SD card slot does support backup and constant recording modes. However, you have to make sure the shooting mode you're in supports SD card writing, and then you can record onto both. According to Panasonic, SSD support over the USB-C port is coming in a future firmware update, which is great to see, especially for video-oriented cameras, as having a bunch of those Samsung T5 drives about is quite a lot cheaper than forking out all that money on CF Express. And you can edit and do it all straight off the SSD itself. Handy for when you're on the go. And finally, in the I/O department, the HDMI port is HDMI 2.1. meaning it can do 4K 120 FPS over HDMI. Just above that is the headphone jack, and above that is the dedicated mic port. One update to the microphone audio setup in this camera is you can now do 4-channel audio. So you can use the hot shoe on the top to attach the XLR device, and you can still use this port on the side to get an extra 2 channels of audio. So great if you need to record tons of sources of audio on a shoot. Now, it's no secret the GH range is definitely aimed way more towards video, but it does have some interesting photo points, so I'll go over those quickly now. If you want to do burst shooting, this probably isn't the camera for you, as you can only do a measly 14 frames per second with the electronic shutter, or 75 where using the digital shutter, but that's only in AF single locked off autofocus mode. If you want AF continuous, that goes down to 7 and 8, depending on your shutter. Notably missing from the photo dial is the 6K photo modes and the photo stacking, which is interesting, probably just to optimize the device a little bit and aim it a little bit more towards that video, taking a bit of that bloat that may not have been used too much on the previous models. It's never a great thing to lose functionality, but I can kind of understand where they're coming from. And now, onto what you've all been waiting for, the GH6's video capabilities. Now, the GH5 and the GH5 II did have 10-bit support, but was restricted to only a few shooting modes and frame rates. GH6 now supports 10-bit on what seems to be all shooting modes at either 422 or 420 chroma subsampling, depending on the shooting mode, of course. Now, along with that amazing 10-bit support comes full fat Vlog, not just Vlog L, and it comes free with the camera. No need to buy it on some dodgy site and get a code sent to you and download it. Vlog's also great for that dynamic range boost. When you turn dynamic range boost on, you are locked to 2000 ISO, but you get that extra stop of exposure so you can really see it not blowing out your highlights. And when you're using Vlog, it's now even more versatile when looking through this screen, as you can load up your own custom LUTs straight onto the camera, which is great for seeing exactly what you're shooting, similar to how it will look in the cutting room. Now, onto the big numbers and resolutions and bit rates and all that. This can shoot up to 5.7K, up to 60 FPS, which is already an insane number to think of because it's in 10-bit and all that, but it's even crazier when you realize that this has completely unlimited record times, provided you don't run out of space, of course. Dropping down a little bit, you can do 4K up to 120 FPS, which is a great bit of slow-mo for 4K footage, which would be great on its own, but it also has the full 10-bit support at 420 chroma subsampling, and you can use Vlog, which is great, meaning you can still grade your slow-mo footage. If you want even slower, you can do 240 FPS at 1080p, which is also 10-bit at 422. But the awesome thing is the high frame rate allows for audio recording and autofocus as well in that mode. If you want to squeeze a little bit more out though, you can go for VFR mode, which will bring it down to 420, but you can hit a whopping 300 FPS in 1080p. But you also lose the audio and the autofocus. And for you anamorphic lovers out there, you also have way more choice with the GH6. Going into the D-Squeeze menu, you can see there's loads of new D-Squeeze options available to you. And you can record at 5.8K at 24, 25 or 30 FPS. Or if you drop it down a little bit, down to 4.4K, you can then go up to 60. Obviously, Micro Four Thirds is very popular with anamorphic users, as that more square style sensor is great for mapping onto those lenses. When actually shooting with the GH6, you'll notice that dynamic range really produces much more cinematic footage than the previous GH5s. The autofocus, every camera they release, they're like, oh, it's better, and definitely, very noticeably, the autofocus is much better on the GH6. Definitely still not a Sony, can be a bit iffy. It is still contrast based, so it is to be expected, but much, much better than it has been, especially in the eye tracking, face tracking modes. But if you don't want to use the autofocus, switching it to manual focus, a small little tweak to the software, probably because now they have a bit more horsepower behind it, is when you're using the manual focus mode, that punch in, that really helps you focus, now works while you're recording, which is great because on the previous models, as soon as you start recording, you lose all assists in helping you focus manually, which you'd think you'd really need, with the GH series not really being known for autofocus. And when you're done all that recording, you can record in either MP4, MOV, or even ProRes. Yes, ProRes recording is now internally on the GH6. At the moment, it's stuck to only 5.7K, but they did say in a future firmware update they will be adding this to more of the resolution modes. Myself personally can't wait to see that update come any sooner, as I see myself shooting 4K more than that full whack 5.7K. And having it down into ProRes format means great for editing and color grading, especially with those new Apple Macs coming out. Now, the GH6 has definitely come into the market at the very top of Micro Four Thirds cameras, but it is quite possibly one of the first really big changes to the Micro Four Thirds space that we've seen in a very long time. Not really seen much from anyone other than maybe Olympus with their RM1. Now, the only question I have is, with so many people wanting full frame nowadays, will anyone actually buy it? It's a hard one, but I think so. The GH6 seems to take the place of its predecessors as that do-it-all video camera, but now way more cinematic and versatile, especially with that mega boost to dynamic range. And no, it's not a big sensor, but it does mean you can save on size and cost on your lens collection. Talking about cost, £2,000 for the body is not a bad price for you indie shooters out there. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on the GH6 in the comments below, or in general about the Micro Four Thirds market. Is it dead? Because there's so much talk about getting on full frame and everyone using full frame nowadays. It's interesting to see who would actually be very interested in the Micro Four Thirds market, because this is still an amazing camera, but for a bit cheaper you can get the S5, which is full frame, but you don't get all these crazy video features packed in with the S5. But yeah, I've been Rob, this has been PhotoBite. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.